I never expected my own ranch, the place I built from nothing, to become the stage for the greatest humiliation of my life. I walked in carrying a small birthday gift for my son, expecting a quiet evening, but instead I found flashing lights, loud music, and a crowd of strangers partying like they owned the land under their feet. And in the middle of it all was my daughter-in-law smiling like she was queen of a kingdom she never built, raising her glass and announcing to everyone, "This is our house, our party, our family," every word cut deeper than the last. My son stood beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes avoiding mine like a boy too ashamed to admit his part in the betrayal. When I stepped forward to ask what was happening, she didn't even hesitate. She pressed her palm into my chest and shoved just enough to make her message clear: "Leave, you are not invited." Laughter followed me to the door, and every step felt like another crack splitting through the foundation of everything I thought my family was. But they mistook my silence for surrender. They had no idea what systems I still controlled, what authority I still had on that land, or how quickly the night could turn against them. So I waited outside in the dark, listening to the music vibrate through walls I paid for and the celebration built on my generosity. And exactly at 11, when their arrogance was at its peak, I flipped the switch that only I had access to. The entire ranch collapsed into blackness. Music died, lights vanished, fear spread like smoke. And in that absolute silence, when they were finally forced to listen, my voice rose through the darkness, ready to deliver the first warning of the reckoning they never saw coming. My name is Henry Caldwell. I'm 72 years old, a retired federal investigator who spent 3 decades chasing criminals before trading my badge for a quieter life on the ranch I built with my late wife, Eleanor. I thought I'd seen the worst of humanity in my career, but nothing prepared me for what my own family would do to me. The evening sun was painting the Texas sky orange and gold as I drove up the familiar dirt road to my ranch. I could see the party from half a mile away: white tents, strings of lights, cars lined up along the fence posts. My son Jason was turning 38 today, and despite everything that had changed since Eleanor passed 2 years ago, I still believed family meant something. I parked my truck near the old barn and walked toward the main house, the house Eleanor and I built with our own hands 40 years ago. Every board, every nail, every stone in that foundation held a memory. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The porch looked different. Eleanor's rocking chair, the one I'd made for her on our 10th anniversary, was gone. In its place sat some modern metal thing that looked like it belonged in a catalog, not on a working ranch. I stepped onto the porch and peered through the window. My heart seized. The walls inside had been stripped bare. Eleanor's photographs, our wedding portrait, the pictures of Jason growing up, all of it replaced with abstract art that meant nothing to anyone. I moved around the side of the house and stopped cold when I saw the garden. Eleanor's garden. She'd spent 20 years cultivating those roses, those lavender bushes, the herbs she used for her famous Sunday dinners. Gone, paved over with flagstones and outdoor furniture. It was like she'd been erased. I steadied myself and walked toward the party tent, telling myself this was still my home, still my land, still my family. Guests mingled with drinks in hand, most of them strangers to me, colleagues of Vanessa's from whatever it was she did in the city. I spotted Jason near the bar and raised my hand to wave. That's when Vanessa appeared. She stepped directly into my path, her smile sharp as a blade. "Oh, everyone," she announced, her voice carrying across the crowd. "This is the old caretaker who used to work the property. Isn't he sweet for stopping by?" Laughter rippled through the guests. Uncomfortable, uncertain laughter, but laughter nonetheless. My face burned. I opened my mouth to correct her, to explain that I was Jason's father, that I owned every acre they were standing on, but Vanessa had already turned away, guiding guests toward the buffet table with practiced ease. I looked for Jason. He was standing 15 feet away, drink in hand, staring at the ground. He wouldn't meet my eyes. My own son, the boy I'd taught to ride horses, to fish, to be a man. He said nothing. I took a breath and walked toward the house. If I couldn't enjoy the party, I'd at least sit in my own living room and wait for a chance to speak with Jason privately. But when I reached the front door, Vanessa was there again, materializing like she'd been watching my every move. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice low enough that nearby guests couldn't hear. "Into my house," I said. "This is a private event." She planted herself in the doorway, arms crossed. "Family only. I am family. I'm his father." She smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. "You're a guest on this property, Henry, and right now you're not welcome inside. Before I could respond, she stepped back and closed the door in my face. I heard the lock click. I stood there, stunned, staring at the wood grain of the door I'd hung myself 35 years ago. Through the window, I watched Jason glance toward me and then deliberately turn away, walking deeper into the crowd. I should have left. Any sensible man would have. But something kept my feet rooted to that porch. Some instinct honed by 30 years of reading criminals and liars. I moved to the side of the house, out of sight, close to the kitchen window that Eleanor always left cracked for ventilation. And I heard Vanessa's voice, low and urgent, speaking to Jason. "He won't matter much longer," she said. "Just get him to sign the papers." The words hung in the air like poison. "He won't matter much longer. Just get him to sign the papers." I stood frozen beneath that kitchen window, letting the meaning sink into my bones. This wasn't about Jason's birthday. This wasn't about family. This was about taking everything Eleanor and I had built together, and my own son was part of the plan. I stepped back from the house, my boots silent on the grass Eleanor had planted when Jason was still learning to walk. The party noise faded behind me as I walked into the darkness beyond the reach of those pretty string lights. I didn't know where I was going at first. My feet just carried me away from the laughter and the lies, away from the son who wouldn't look at me and the woman who wanted me gone. I found myself at the old barn. The structure rose against the darkening sky, like a monument to another time. Eleanor and I raised this barn in the summer of 1983, back when Jason was just 5 years old and used to hand us nails from a bucket, so proud to be helping. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar smell of hay and old wood and decades of honest work. My hand found the nearest beam in the darkness. I ran my palm along the grain, feeling the grooves and imperfections, remembering the day we'd hauled this timber from the lumberyard in my old Ford pickup. Eleanor had been 8 months pregnant with what would have been our second child. We lost the baby that winter, but we never lost each other. Every beam in this barn held a piece of our story. I closed my eyes and heard her voice, not from a speaker or a recording, but from memory. The last conversation we had before the cancer took her. She'd been so weak by then, barely able to lift her head from the pillow, but her eyes were still sharp, still fierce. "Protect what we built," she'd whispered, gripping my hand with what little strength she had left. "Trust no one who wants to replace me." I'd thought she was talking about the ranch, about the land and the cattle and the legacy we'd created from nothing. But standing in that barn, hearing Vanessa's words echo in my mind, I realized Eleanor had seen something I'd missed. She'd seen the threat coming. She'd tried to warn me. The grief that had lived in my chest for 2 years began to shift, hardening into something else, something colder, something more useful. I moved through the barn with purpose now, navigating the darkness from memory alone. Past the old tractor that hadn't run since '97, past the workbench where I'd taught Jason to use his first hammer, past the storage room where we kept feed and supplies. Behind a stack of hay bales, hidden from anyone who didn't know exactly where to look, was a small metal panel set into the wall. The main breaker box. Eleanor and I had installed this ourselves when we rewired the property back in '91. We'd kept it hidden deliberately, away from the main electrical panel in the house, because Eleanor was always worried about storms and power surges. Only the two of us knew it existed. Vanessa could have lived on this ranch for 50 years and never found it. I opened the panel and looked at the rows of switches. The master breaker sat at the top, controlling every electrical system on the property. The house, the guest cabin, the new party tent with its fancy lights and sound system. Everything Vanessa had orchestrated to impress her friends and humiliate me. My hand hovered over the switch. A younger man might have hesitated, a weaker man might have walked away, but I'd spent 30 years in federal law enforcement, dealing with criminals who thought they were smarter than everyone else. I knew how to handle people who underestimated me. I pulled the switch. The effect was immediate. Every light on the property died at once. The music cut out mid-song. In the sudden silence, I heard the screams begin, high-pitched shrieks of surprise and confusion drifting across the night air from the party tent. Vanessa's carefully constructed evening had just collapsed into chaos. But I wasn't finished. I made my way to the corner of the barn where Eleanor's old speaker system still hung from the rafters. She'd installed it years ago so we could listen to music while we worked, running wires all the way out to the paddock and the main house. The system ran on a separate battery backup, something Eleanor had insisted on because she never wanted to work in silence. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the auxiliary port. On the screen was an audio file I'd saved 2 years ago, recorded in the hospice room 3 days before Eleanor died. She'd wanted to leave a message for the ranch, for the land she loved. I'd never had the courage to listen to it again. Tonight, I pressed play. Eleanor's voice rang out across the dark ranch, clear and strong despite the weakness that had plagued her final days. I didn't leave this ranch for strangers. The screaming intensified. Through the barn door, I could see figures stumbling in the darkness, knocking over chairs and tables, trampling the decorations Vanessa had spent weeks arranging. Someone shouted about calling the police. Someone else was crying about ghosts. I heard Vanessa's voice rising above the chaos, demanding that someone fix the lights, find the breaker, do something. I stepped out of the barn and stood in the shadows, watching the pandemonium unfold. A younger version of myself might have felt guilty, might have questioned whether this was too far, too petty, too cruel. But that man had died somewhere between hearing my daughter-in-law call me the old caretaker and watching my son turn his back on me. What remained was something different, something patient, something that knew exactly how to dismantle a predator piece by piece. This wasn't grief, this was strategy. And Vanessa Caldwell had just made her first mistake. She'd forgotten that quiet old men sometimes have teeth. I let the chaos run for exactly 4 minutes. Long enough for Vanessa to lose control of her guests. Long enough for the fear and confusion to strip away that polished veneer of her perfect party. Long enough for everyone present to understand that something had fundamentally shifted on this ranch tonight. Then I walked to the storage shed beside the barn and retrieved Eleanor's emergency lantern. She'd bought it at an antique store in Fredericksburg the year we got married. A beautiful brass oil lamp with a glass chimney that threw warm golden light in every direction. Eleanor had always believed in being prepared for anything. Storms, power outages, unexpected visitors in the night. She kept that lantern filled and ready for decades, and I'd maintained the tradition after she passed. Tonight, her foresight would serve a different purpose. I lit the wick and watched the flame catch, casting dancing shadows across my weathered hands. Then I walked toward the main house, moving slowly and deliberately through the darkness while guests stumbled and cursed around me. The back door was unlocked. It always had been, ever since Eleanor and I decided we'd never lock our home against our neighbors. Vanessa had apparently never thought to change that particular habit. I stepped inside and moved through the kitchen, the lantern light preceding me like a herald announcing the arrival of someone important. When I emerged into the living room, the effect was immediate. Guests who had been fumbling with their phones, trying to use flashlight apps to navigate the unfamiliar space, turned toward the steady golden glow. They saw me standing there in my worn jeans and flannel shirt, holding that antique lantern like I'd stepped out of another century, and something in their expressions changed. The panic began to drain away, replaced by a strange kind of relief. Here was someone who knew what he was doing. Here was someone in control. Vanessa's reaction was the opposite. She'd been screaming orders at anyone who would listen, demanding that someone find the breaker box, call an electrician, do something to salvage her ruined evening. When she saw me standing in the doorway with that lamp, her voice cut off mid-sentence. For just a moment, I saw real fear flicker across her face before she buried it beneath a mask of indignation. "What did you do?" she hissed. I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I walked further into the room, letting the lantern light fall across the walls she'd stripped bare, the floors she'd covered with expensive rugs that didn't belong here, the furniture that had replaced every piece Eleanor and I had chosen together. The guests parted before me like I was Moses approaching the Red Sea. "This ranch remembers who built it," I said, my voice carrying easily in the silence. I spoke slowly, clearly, the way I used to speak when I was questioning suspects who thought they could outsmart a federal investigator. Every beam, every stone, every acre of this land knows the hands that shaped it. I turned to face Vanessa directly. The lantern light carved deep shadows across my face, and I saw several guests step back instinctively. Good. Let them see that the old caretaker was something more than they'd been told. "I've dealt with people like you before," I said, holding her gaze. "In my previous career, I spent 30 years watching clever people try to take things that didn't belong to them. You know what they all had in common?" I paused, letting the question hang in the air. They always underestimated the quiet ones. Vanessa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I'd seen that expression before, on the faces of criminals who suddenly realized they'd miscalculated badly. The guests were murmuring now, exchanging glances, reassessing everything they'd been told about the old man who supposedly just worked here. That's when Tom Bradley spoke up. Tom was a local banker, had been for 40 years. He'd helped Eleanor and me secure our first loan to buy this property back when we were young and foolish enough to think we could turn scrubland into a working ranch. He'd watched us succeed through sheer stubbornness and hard work, and he knew exactly whose name was on every legal document associated with this land. "Wait a minute," Tom said, pushing his glasses up his nose and squinting at me in the lamplight. "Henry, don't you legally own everything here? The deed to this ranch is still in your name, isn't it?" I processed the paperwork myself when Eleanor passed. Nothing was transferred. The murmuring intensified. I watched the realization spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. The old caretaker owned the ranch. The man Vanessa had publicly humiliated, had barred from entering his own home, was the legal owner of every acre they were standing on. Vanessa's face went white, not pink with embarrassment or red with anger, but genuinely, deathly pale. She recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that fooled no one. "This is a family matter," she announced, her voice too bright, too sharp. "Tom, you know how complicated estate situations can be. Henry is just confused about some of the arrangements we've been discussing." She reached out and grabbed Jason's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Honey, let's go talk in the kitchen. We need to sort this out privately." But I wasn't watching Vanessa anymore. I was watching my son. Jason flinched when she touched him. Not the way a man flinches when he's annoyed by his wife's grip. Not the way someone reacts to a minor inconvenience. This was something deeper, something instinctive. His whole body tensed, his shoulders hunched slightly, and for just a fraction of a second, I saw naked fear flash across his face. I knew that look. I'd seen it hundreds of times during my career, on the faces of witnesses who were terrified of the people controlling them, on the faces of victims who'd learned that resistance only brought more pain. My son wasn't just weak. My son was afraid of his own wife. Vanessa pulled him toward the kitchen, and Jason went without protest, without even glancing back at me. But that flinch had told me everything I needed to know. This situation was more complicated than a greedy daughter-in-law trying to steal a ranch. Something else was happening here. Something darker. And I was going to find out exactly what Vanessa Caldwell was holding over my son's head. I watched them disappear into the kitchen, Vanessa's grip on Jason's arm tight enough to leave bruises. The other guests milled about uncertainly, some trying to make conversation, others checking their phones, all of them pretending they hadn't just witnessed something deeply uncomfortable. Tom Bradley caught my eye and gave me a small nod of solidarity before turning to speak with his wife in low tones. I moved quietly toward the back of the house, keeping to the shadows beyond the reach of my lantern's glow. The guests barely noticed me leave. They were too busy processing what had just happened, too busy recalculating their assumptions about the frail old caretaker who apparently owned the entire ranch their hostess had been showing off all evening. What none of them knew, what Vanessa certainly didn't know, was that Eleanor had installed an intercom system throughout this house back in 1992. She'd wanted to be able to call Jason in for dinner, no matter which room he was hiding in, and later she'd used it to listen to her radio programs while she worked in different parts of the house. The system was old, practically antique by modern standards, but it still functioned perfectly, and the kitchen speaker had a habit of broadcasting to the hallway unit whenever someone spoke loudly enough. I positioned myself near the back door, close to the small speaker box mounted on the wall. Eleanor had covered it with a decorative frame years ago, making it look like nothing more than a piece of folk art. Vanessa had probably walked past it 1,000 times without ever realizing what it was. Her voice came through clearly, sharp with barely contained rage. "Your father is ruining everything." Each word dripped with venom. "Do you understand what just happened out there? Tom Bradley knows. By tomorrow morning, everyone in this county will know that I don't own this ranch, that I'm not the lady of the house, that I'm just the daughter-in-law of some stubborn old man who won't have the decency to die or sign over his property." I heard Jason mumble something indistinct, his voice too low for the intercom to pick up clearly. "Don't make excuses," Vanessa snapped. "You need to get him to sign the power of attorney this week, not next month, not when he's ready. This week. Do you hear me? Vanessa, please. He's my father. I can't just, you can and you will. Her voice dropped to something even more dangerous than shouting, a cold and controlled threat that made my blood run cold. Or I swear I'll. She stopped herself. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. When Jason spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper, but the intercom caught it perfectly. The fear in his words cut through me like a knife. Please, Vanessa, you promised you wouldn't tell anyone. Just give me more time. I'll talk to him. I'll convince him. Just please, don't. Then convince him faster. The softness in her voice was somehow worse than the anger. You know what happens if I decide you're not useful anymore. You know what I have, what I can do with it. I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. This wasn't a marriage. This was captivity. My son wasn't choosing Vanessa over me out of weakness or preference. He was being controlled, manipulated, held hostage by something she knew about him. Something bad enough that the mere threat of exposure reduced a grown man to begging. Near the kitchen doorway, I noticed two guests had drifted close enough to hear fragments of the conversation through the intercom speaker in the hallway. They exchanged horrified glances. Did she just threaten him? One woman whispered to her companion. What could she possibly be holding over him? The man replied, his voice hushed but carrying clearly in the quiet house. I turned away from the speaker, my thoughts churning. The anger I'd felt earlier, that righteous indignation at being humiliated and dismissed, was fading. In its place grew something more complicated: concern, worry, the protective instinct of a father who suddenly realizes his child is in danger. Jason had done something serious enough that Vanessa could use it as a leash, yanking him in whatever direction she wanted. Something shameful enough that he'd rather betray his own father than risk having it exposed. I thought about the past 5 years, all the times Jason had seemed distant, distracted, not quite himself. I'd blamed grief over Eleanor. I'd blamed Vanessa's influence. I'd blamed my son's weakness of character. But what if none of that was the real explanation? What if he'd been trapped this entire time, slowly suffocating under the weight of a secret his wife wielded like a weapon? I stepped out the back door into the cool night air, still holding Eleanor's lantern. The flame flickered in the breeze, casting dancing shadows across the porch where my wife and I had sat together for 40 years, talking about our dreams and our fears and the future we were building. What did you do, son? I whispered into the darkness. And how long has she been using it against you? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the small cabin on the edge of the property, the cabin Eleanor and I had built as a guest house 30 years ago, and which had become my refuge since Vanessa made it clear I wasn't welcome in my own home. The lantern burned low on the table beside me as I turned the events of the evening over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd heard through that old intercom speaker. My son was being blackmailed by his own wife. That much was clear. But with what? Jason had always been a decent kid, if a bit soft. He'd never been in trouble with the law, never shown any signs of the kind of darkness that leads men to do terrible things. What secret could Vanessa possibly be holding that would reduce him to such complete submission? The questions circled endlessly, offering no answers, until the first gray light of dawn began creeping through the cabin windows. I made coffee on the old propane stove and sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over land that had been in my care for 4 decades. Whatever was coming, I would face it the way I'd faced every challenge in my life, head on, with my eyes open. The sound of tires on gravel pulled me from my thoughts around 8 in the morning. I recognized the vehicle immediately, a silver sedan that had been parked in my driveway more times than I could count over the years. Linda Hargrove, Eleanor's best friend since childhood. The woman who had stood beside my wife at our wedding and held her hand during her final hours in hospice. Linda stepped out of the car carrying something I hadn't seen in years. Eleanor's antique music box, the one with the hand-painted roses on the lid and the delicate brass hinges that played Clair de Lune when you opened it. Eleanor had kept that box in a safety deposit box at the bank downtown, always saying it contained things too precious to risk losing in a fire or a flood. I'd never asked what was inside. Some things between a woman and her memories deserve to remain private. Henry. Linda climbed the porch steps slowly, her face drawn with an expression I couldn't quite read. Grief. Certainly she'd never fully recovered from losing Eleanor. But there was something else there too. Determination, maybe. Purpose. Linda. I stood and offered her the other chair. I wasn't expecting company. No. I don't suppose you were. She sat down heavily, placing the music box on the small table between us. Her fingers lingered on the painted lid for a moment before she spoke again. I heard about what happened last night. Tom Bradley called me this morning. He told me everything. Word travels fast in a small town. It does when people are worried about you. Linda turned to face me directly, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. Eleanor gave me strict instructions, Henry. 23 months ago, right before she died, she made me promise to keep this safe, to hold on to it until… She paused, gathering herself. Until someone tried to take what's yours. I stared at the music box. Eleanor gave you this? She gave me instructions. The box was already in the safety deposit box. She just added me to the access list without telling anyone. She said, if things ever got bad, if anyone ever tried to push you out of your home or steal your ranch, I was to bring this to you immediately. Linda pushed the box toward me. After what Tom told me about last night, I'd say we've reached that point. I lifted the lid carefully. The familiar notes of Clair de Lune tinkled out, and for a moment I was transported back to 100 quiet evenings with Eleanor, listening to that melody while we talked about nothing and everything. Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, was a sealed envelope. Eleanor's handwriting marked the front in her distinctive cursive, Hachon. There's more than one envelope, Linda said quietly. Eleanor was very specific. Each one is for a different stage of danger. I'll bring the others when the time is right. She left instructions for that too. But this one, she tapped the envelope with one finger. This one is for now. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the weight of whatever documents lay inside. My wife had been dying. She'd been weak, exhausted, consumed by the cancer that was eating her alive. And yet she'd found the strength to prepare for a threat she might never live to see. There's something else you need to know, Linda continued. About 2 years ago, maybe 6 months before Eleanor passed, my niece Sarah was working as a paralegal at the Morrison firm downtown. A woman came in asking questions about expedited inheritance procedures, how to speed up the transfer of property from elderly family members, how to initiate competency hearings to have someone declared mentally unfit. Linda's voice hardened. That woman was Vanessa Caldwell. The pieces began falling into place. Vanessa had been planning this for years, long before Eleanor died. She'd been laying the groundwork, researching her options, preparing to strike the moment my wife was out of the picture. Sarah mentioned it to me because she thought it was odd, Linda said. A young woman asking such specific questions about elderly relatives. I told Eleanor. I thought she'd want to warn you, but instead she just got very quiet and asked me to trust her. Said she was going to handle it her own way. Linda gestured toward the envelope in my hands. This is her way, Henry. Your wife saw this coming. She left you weapons. I looked down at Eleanor's handwriting, feeling the familiar ache of her absence mixing with something new. Pride, maybe. Gratitude. Even in death, she was still protecting me. Now open the first one, Linda said, and let's find out what Eleanor wanted you to know. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal on the envelope. It wasn't age or weakness causing the tremor, it was the weight of what I was about to do. This was Eleanor's voice reaching across the divide between life and death, and part of me wasn't sure I was ready to hear what she had to say. Linda sat quietly beside me, giving me the space I needed. She'd been Eleanor's closest friend for over 50 years, and she understood better than anyone that some moments require silence. Inside the envelope were 2 documents. The first was a legal paper, thick and formal, bearing the letterhead of a law firm in Austin I didn't recognize. I scanned the opening paragraphs and felt my breath catch in my throat. It was Eleanor's will, not the simple document we drafted together years ago, but a revised version dated just 3 months before her death. She'd done this without telling me, without even hinting that she was making changes. I read through the legal language carefully, my years of experience helping me parse the formal terminology. The core provisions were clear and absolute. The ranch and all associated properties belonged to me for the duration of my natural life. No exceptions, no conditions. No one could force a sale, initiate a transfer, or claim ownership while I was still breathing. But the section regarding inheritance was what truly caught my attention. Jason was named as the eventual heir, but with a clause I'd never seen before in any will. He could only inherit if he demonstrated, in the judgment of a designated trustee, moral character and family loyalty consistent with the values upon which this property was built. The trustee named was Mark Ellison, an old friend and attorney who'd known our family for decades. In practical terms, this meant Jason would have to earn his inheritance. It meant Vanessa couldn't simply wait for me to die and then claim everything through her husband. It meant Eleanor had built a fortress around our legacy and handed me the keys. The second document was a handwritten letter, 3 pages of Eleanor's elegant script on the cream-colored stationery she'd always loved. I recognized the slight shake in some of the letters. She must have written this when the illness was already weakening her hands. But her words were as sharp and clear as they'd ever been. "My dearest Henry," the letter began, and I had to stop for a moment, blinking back the tears that threatened to blur my vision. Linda placed a gentle hand on my arm but said nothing. I continued reading. "If you're reading this, then she's made her move. I prayed this day would never come, that I was wrong about Vanessa, that my suspicions were just the paranoid imaginings of a dying woman. But I've watched her for 2 years now, and I know what she is. She's not just greedy, Henry. She's dangerous. I found things about her past that frightened me, things I've documented in the other envelopes. Please be careful. Trust your instincts. And remember, even though I'm gone, I'm still protecting you. I always will be." I turned to the second page, my heart pounding against my ribs. Eleanor's handwriting grew slightly more uneven here, as if she'd been fighting exhaustion to get the words down. "I know Vanessa's next moves because I've seen her type before. She'll try to isolate you first, make you seem confused or incompetent to anyone who might help you. When she threatens to have you declared mentally unfit, when she starts talking about competency hearings and guardianship, that's when you'll need the second envelope. Linda knows where to find it. Don't open it before then, the timing matters." The final page was shorter, just a few paragraphs, but the words hit me harder than anything that came before. "I love you, Henry Caldwell. I've loved you since the day you walked into my father's hardware store with sawdust in your hair and asked me to help you pick out nails. I've loved you through 40 years of building something beautiful together. And I love you now, even though I won't be there to say it out loud. Trust yourself, my darling. You spent 30 years catching criminals. You know how to handle people like Vanessa. You've always been stronger than you let anyone see. Now it's time to show her exactly who she's dealing with." I lowered the letter and stared at those final lines until the words blurred and reformed and blurred again. She knew. All those years, I'd kept my career deliberately vague, telling people I'd worked for the government before retiring to ranch life. I'd never wanted my past to define me here, never wanted neighbors to look at me differently because of the things I'd seen and done in service of justice. Eleanor had never pressed me for details, never asked questions when I woke from nightmares about old cases or when certain news stories made me go quiet and distant. But she'd known. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to understand that the quiet rancher she'd married had spent 3 decades hunting predators far more dangerous than Vanessa Caldwell. Enough to trust that when the time came, I would know exactly what to do. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest, feeling closer to my wife in that moment than I had since the day she died. She was still protecting me, still fighting for our family, still loving me across the impossible distance between her world and mine, and I would not let her down. The days following my discovery of Eleanor's letter were quiet on the surface, but beneath that calm, I could feel something building. Vanessa had retreated to the main house after the disaster of the birthday party, and Jason hadn't visited my cabin or called. The silence felt deliberate, strategic. She was regrouping, planning her next move. I didn't have to wait long to learn what it was. 3 days after Linda brought me the music box, my phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Robert Simmons, the branch manager at First National Bank in town. Robert and I had known each other for 30 years. He'd approved the loan that helped Eleanor and me expand our cattle operation back in the 90s, and he'd been a pallbearer at her funeral. "Henry, I thought you should know something." Robert's voice was tight with barely contained anger. "Your daughter-in-law came into the bank this morning. She demanded access to all records related to your ranch mortgage status, account balances, property assessments. When my staff explained that she had no legal standing to access that information, she made quite a scene. I sat down heavily in my chair. What kind of scene? She started telling everyone within earshot that you're mentally declining, said she was trying to protect family assets from a confused old man who didn't know what year it was." Robert paused. "Henry, she used words like dementia and incompetent. She was laying groundwork, making sure people heard her narrative. I had to ask her to leave. I thanked Robert and ended the call, my mind already racing through the implications. Vanessa was moving faster than I'd expected. She wasn't just trying to pressure me into signing documents anymore. She was building a public case for having me declared mentally unfit, creating witnesses who would remember the concerned daughter-in-law worried about her poor, confused father-in-law. The second call came that afternoon from a source I hadn't anticipated. David Morrison, senior partner at the law firm where Linda's niece had once worked. I'd never spoken to him directly, but Eleanor had apparently maintained a relationship with him that I knew nothing about. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm calling as a courtesy," Morrison said, his tone careful and professional. "A woman came to my office today inquiring about emergency conservatorship procedures. She wanted to know how quickly she could assume legal control over an elderly relative's affairs and assets. Let me guess. Vanessa Caldwell. I'm not at liberty to confirm client identities, but I can tell you that the woman in question made several claims about her relative that struck me as suspicious. She alleged that he wanders at night, forgets the names of family members, and recently caused a dangerous incident at a family gathering." Morrison cleared his throat. "She also seemed unaware that I worked with your late wife on several matters before her passing. Eleanor was a remarkable woman, Mr. Caldwell. She spoke very highly of you, and she expressed concerns about certain members of your family. I thought you should know that someone is actively seeking legal means to take control of your affairs." I thanked Morrison for the warning and sat staring at the wall of my cabin for a long time after hanging up. Vanessa was attacking on multiple fronts, seeding the community with stories about my supposed mental decline while simultaneously exploring legal avenues to strip me of my autonomy. It was a coordinated campaign, methodical and ruthless. Eleanor had been right. This woman was dangerous. That evening, I made my way to the main house under the pretense of checking on some equipment in the barn. The truth was, I wanted to observe, to gather information the way I'd been trained to do during my years as an investigator. I positioned myself in the shadows near the kitchen window, the same spot where I'd overheard Vanessa's threats to Jason just days before. The sound of a phone ringing drifted through the open window, followed by Vanessa's voice answering with her usual practiced charm. "Hello? Yes, this is she." A pause. Then her tone changed completely. "What did you say?" The charm evaporated, replaced by something I'd never heard from her before. Raw fear. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I watched through the window as Vanessa's face drained of color. Her hand gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said, her voice cracking. "You have the wrong person. Don't call here again." She slammed the phone down with enough force to rattle the dishes on the counter. Jason looked up from where he'd been sitting at the kitchen table, concern crossing his features. "Vanessa? What's wrong? Who was that?" "Wrong number." The words came out sharp as broken glass. "Don't ask me again." She stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Jason staring after her with the bewildered expression of a man who knows he's not being told the truth but lacks the courage to demand it. I slipped away from the window, my investigator's mind cataloging what I'd just witnessed. In all my observations of Vanessa, I'd never seen her lose control like that. She was always composed, always calculating, but that phone call had shattered her mask completely. Before she'd hung up, I'd caught fragments of what the caller said. Something about an estate, something about Florida, and a name that made a predator suddenly look like prey. Patterson. Who was William Patterson? What had happened in Florida? And why did that name turn Vanessa Caldwell into a terrified woman? I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start looking. I spent the next 2 days digging into the name Patterson, using contacts from my former life that I'd hoped never to call upon again. The pieces were still scattered, the picture incomplete, but what I was finding suggested that Vanessa Caldwell had a past far darker than simple greed. I was so focused on that investigation that I almost missed the crisis unfolding in my own family. It was Thursday evening when I heard the truck coming up the road to my cabin. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I recognized the vehicle immediately, Jason's pickup, the one I'd helped him buy when he graduated college. He rarely drove out here anymore, and never at this hour. Something was wrong. I stepped onto the porch as he parked and climbed out of the truck. Even in the dim light spilling from my cabin windows, I could see that my son was broken. His shoulders slumped forward like a man carrying an impossible weight. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. He walked toward me with the shuffling steps of someone who had finally reached the end of his rope. "Dad." His voice cracked on the single syllable. "I need to tell you something. I should have told you years ago, but I was scared. And then Vanessa, and now I don't know what to do anymore." I guided him inside and sat him down at my small kitchen table. I poured 2 glasses of whiskey and placed one in front of him, then took the seat across from him and waited. After 30 years of conducting interviews and interrogations, I knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply create space for someone to speak. Jason wrapped both hands around his glass but didn't drink. The words came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "She gave me an ultimatum today," he said. "Get you to sign the power of attorney by Friday, or she tells the police about the accident. She said I'll lose everything, my freedom, my reputation, the inheritance. She said I have to choose." He laughed bitterly. "As if there's really a choice, as if there ever has been." "What accident, son?" Jason finally looked up at me, and I saw the full depth of his shame reflected in his eyes. 5 years ago, Dad. It was a Saturday night. I'd been drinking at a bar in Austin too much. Way too much. I should have called a cab, but I thought I was fine. I thought I could make it home." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I hit someone. A man crossing the street. I saw him too late, and I swerved, but not enough. He went over my hood, onto the pavement. I stopped for maybe 10 seconds, saw him lying there, and I panicked. I drove away. I left him there, Dad. I left a man bleeding in the street, and I drove away." The silence that followed was heavy with years of hidden guilt. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for the rest. "He survived," Jason continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But he had permanent injuries. A shattered hip. Nerve damage in his leg. He'll never walk normally again. The police investigated, but they never found me. I thought it was over. I thought I'd gotten away with it." He laughed again, and this time there was no humor in it at all. "Then Vanessa found out. I don't know how she has connections, people who dig up information for her. She showed me photos from that night, or copies of the police report I thought was buried. She's had that evidence hanging over my head for 3 years now. Every time I think about standing up to her, every time I consider telling you the truth, she reminds me what she can do. One phone call, and my life is over." I sat back in my chair, processing everything my son had just told me. The anger I might have felt was tempered by something else, an understanding that had been building ever since I'd watched him flinch at Vanessa's touch. He wasn't weak, he was trapped. And the trap had been carefully constructed by a woman who knew exactly how to exploit human weakness. "Dad, I'm sorry." Jason's voice broke completely now. "I'm so sorry for what I did to that man, for what I've let Vanessa do to you, for being too much of a coward to tell you the truth." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Son, look at me." He raised his eyes, clearly expecting condemnation. What he saw instead made him blink in confusion. "I spent 30 years as a federal investigator before I retired to build this ranch," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I interrogated criminals. I tracked down fraudsters. I dismantled networks of people who thought they were smarter than everyone else in the room. Did you really think I wouldn't know how to handle someone like Vanessa?" Jason stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "You? What?" "Your mother knew. She always knew, even though I tried to keep that part of my life separate from the family we built here." I squeezed his hand. "You made a terrible mistake 5 years ago, and you'll have to face the consequences for that. A man was hurt because of your choices, and that debt doesn't disappear just because time has passed. But first, we're going to deal with your wife." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark ranch that Eleanor and I had built from nothing. Vanessa thinks she's the smartest person in every room she enters. She thinks she's found the perfect victim in you and the perfect target in me. But I've been investigating her for days now, and I've learned something important. I turned back to face my son, letting him see the cold determination that had served me through 3 decades of hunting predators. "She's done this before, Jason, and I'm going to prove it." The morning after Jason's confession, I drove into town to see Mark Ellison. Mark had been our family attorney for 25 years, handling everything from property transactions to Eleanor's estate. He was a good man, thorough and discreet, but I'd never told him the full truth about my background. That was about to change. His office sat on the 2nd floor of an old brick building on Main Street, the same location he'd occupied since opening his practice in 1986. The receptionist waved me through with a familiar smile, and I found Mark behind his desk, surrounded by the organized chaos of legal documents and reference books that seemed to define his existence. Henry. He stood to shake my hand, his grip firm despite the arthritis I knew troubled him. Linda called yesterday and said I should expect you. She was cryptic, but she made it sound urgent. I settled into the leather chair across from his desk and took a moment to gather my thoughts. What I was about to share would change how Mark saw me, and I wasn't entirely sure how he would react. Mark, I need to tell you something about myself that I've kept private since I moved to this town. Before I became a rancher, before I met Eleanor at her father's hardware store, I had another life. I spent 30 years working for a federal agency investigating financial crimes, elder fraud, and organized exploitation rings. I've put away people who preyed on the vulnerable, dismantled networks that stole millions from retirees, and testified in cases that made national headlines. I paused, watching his expression shift from polite attention to genuine surprise. I retired because I wanted to leave that world behind. I wanted to build something peaceful with the woman I loved. But it seems that world has found me again. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying me with new eyes. I always knew you were sharp, Henry. Sharper than you let on. But this, I had no idea. That was the point. I allowed myself a small smile. A man in my former profession makes enemies. Keeping a low profile wasn't just preference, it was survival. But my daughter-in-law has forced my hand. She's trying to take everything Eleanor and I built, and she's using my son as a weapon to do it. I spent the next hour laying out everything I knew about Vanessa's schemes, the bank visits, the inquiries about conservatorship, the threats she'd made to Jason, and my suspicions about her past. Mark listened without interruption, taking occasional notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression growing grimmer with each new detail. When I finished, he set down his pen and met my gaze directly. What do you want to do? I want to build a fortress she can't penetrate. And then I want to tear down every wall she's hiding behind. We spent the next 3 hours constructing that fortress. Mark drew up papers to transfer the ranch and all associated assets into an irrevocable trust with me as the lifetime beneficiary. The trust was structured with provisions I'd seen used in federal cases, protections specifically designed to prevent exploitation of elderly property owners. Most importantly, we included a clause that automatically voided any power of attorney document as it related to assets held within the trust. Even if Vanessa somehow tricked or coerced me into signing a POA, it would be legally worthless. She could waive that paper at every bank and institution in Texas, and it wouldn't give her access to a single acre of my land. This is ironclad, Mark said as he reviewed the final documents. She'd need to have the trust itself dissolved, which would require proving fraud or incapacity in its creation. Given that we're establishing it now, with witnesses and full documentation of your mental competency, that would be essentially impossible. I signed every page he put in front of me, feeling a grim satisfaction with each stroke of the pen. Eleanor had left me weapons in her envelopes. Now I was forging some of my own. After leaving Mark's office, I drove to the ranch and found Charlie Boone repairing a fence near the south pasture. Charlie had worked for us for 15 years, a quiet man who noticed everything and said little. I trusted him completely. Charlie, I need your help with something. I explained what I needed: documentation of Vanessa's activities, her visitors, her movements, anything unusual. But I want to be clear about the boundaries. Legal channels only. Photographs from public spaces. Notes on what you observe during your normal work. We're not breaking any laws, and we're not giving her any ammunition to use against us. Understood? Charlie nodded slowly, a hard glint appearing in his weathered eyes. I never liked that woman, Mr. Caldwell. Always felt like she was measuring things, calculating what everything was worth. He spat into the dust. I'll keep my eyes open. That evening, I called Linda from my cabin. It's time, I told her. The man who called Vanessa about Florida, you said Eleanor knew how to reach him? She left instructions, Linda confirmed. A name and a number, sealed in with the other documents. She said when you were ready to go on the offensive, this man would be your most important ally. I'm ready. Make the call. 2 days later, Mark Ellison phoned me with a question that had clearly been troubling him since our meeting. Henry, you've got me setting up defenses like we're preparing for war. You're investigating Vanessa's past, contacting mysterious allies, building a case piece by piece. I need to know, what exactly do you expect to find? I stared out the window of my cabin at the land Eleanor and I had nurtured for 40 years. The land Vanessa wanted to steal. The land she thought would be easy pickings from a helpless old man. A dead husband, I said quietly, and I don't think he died naturally. Linda arrived at my cabin the following afternoon, her face drawn with an expression I'd come to recognize over the past week, the look of someone carrying information they almost wished they didn't have. She held a manila envelope in her hands, thicker than the first one, with the number 2 written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. "I got a call this morning," she said as she settled into the chair across from me. "From a man named Rowan. He said Eleanor had given him my number years ago, told him to contact me if anything ever happened to her. He said he's been waiting for the right time." She placed the envelope on the table between us. "He also said that when you open this, you'll understand why he spent the last 7 years of his life trying to destroy Vanessa Caldwell." I picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. Whatever was inside represented months of Eleanor's secret work, an investigation she'd conducted while fighting for her life. The depth of her love, the lengths she'd gone to protect me even as cancer consumed her body, it still took my breath away. I broke the seal and spread the contents across the table. The first document was a private investigator's report, 40 pages of single-spaced text with photographs and official records attached. Eleanor had hired someone good, a former FBI agent based in Miami who specialized in background investigations. The subject of the report was listed as Vanessa Marie Patterson, formerly Vanessa Marie Collins, currently Vanessa Marie Caldwell. I began reading, and with each page, the picture of my daughter-in-law grew darker. Before she married my son, Vanessa had been Vanessa Patterson, wife of William Robert Patterson, a 68-year-old retired businessman who owned a waterfront estate in Sarasota, Florida. According to the investigators' findings, Vanessa had met William at a charity event, charmed him with her youth and attention, and married him within 6 months. William's adult children had objected to the relationship, warning their father that a 30-year-old woman pursuing a man more than twice her age was almost certainly after his money. William dismissed their concerns. He was lonely after his first wife's death, flattered by Vanessa's interest, eager to believe that someone young and beautiful could genuinely love him. 18 months after the wedding, William signed a comprehensive power of attorney granting Vanessa complete control over his financial affairs. He told his children he was simplifying his life, letting his wife handle the tedious details so he could enjoy his retirement. 3 months after that, William Patterson was dead. The official cause of death was accidental, a fall down the stairs of his own home. Vanessa claimed she'd been out shopping when it happened, returning to find her husband lying broken at the bottom of the staircase. The police investigated, found no evidence of foul play, and closed the case. But William's children refused to accept that verdict. They hired their own investigators, their own attorneys. They contested the will and the POA, claiming undue influence and suspicious circumstances. The case was settled out of court. Vanessa walked away with $2.3 million. The family got the house and most of William's other assets, but they never got justice. According to Eleanor's investigator, they remained convinced that Vanessa had murdered their father and gotten away with it. Eleanor had attached her own notes to the report, handwritten observations and conclusions that chilled me to the bone. "Henry, I've spent 6 months studying this woman. She's not impulsive, she's patient. She doesn't make obvious moves, she's methodical. She targets vulnerable men, isolates them from family, gains legal control of their assets, and then they die." William Patterson was her first victim, or at least the first one I could find. I don't believe he'll be her last. At the bottom of Eleanor's notes was a final paragraph that made my chest tighten. "She's watching for signs of weakness. Don't give her any. The man who's been investigating her since his father's death is named Rowan. He became a law enforcement officer specifically to find the evidence that would put Vanessa away forever. He'll find you when he's ready. Trust him. He wants justice even more than you do." I set down Eleanor's notes and picked up the photograph that had been paper-clipped to the investigator's report. William Robert Patterson stared back at me from what looked like a family portrait taken a few years before his death. White hair, weathered face, broad shoulders. A man who'd worked hard all his life and was enjoying the fruits of his labor. A man who'd been lonely enough to let a predator into his home. A man who looked eerily like me. Same age, same build, same trusting smile, same vulnerability that came with losing a spouse and facing old age alone. I stared at that photograph for a long time, understanding finally clicking into place. Vanessa hadn't chosen Jason because she loved him. She'd chosen Jason because of me. Because I was William Patterson with a different name and a Texas ranch instead of a Florida estate. Because she'd developed a method that worked, and she was running it again with refinements. William Patterson had been her rehearsal. I was her encore. The only difference was that William hadn't seen her coming. William hadn't spent 30 years learning to recognize predators. William hadn't had a wife who loved him enough to build a defensive fortress from beyond the grave. Vanessa Caldwell had made one critical miscalculation. She thought I was just like William Patterson, another lonely old man waiting to be consumed. But I wasn't prey. I was the trap. The knowledge of who Vanessa truly was changed everything and nothing. I still had to play my part, still had to execute the strategy that would bring her down. But now I understood the stakes. This wasn't just about protecting my ranch or saving my son from a manipulative wife. This was about stopping a killer before she killed again. I called Jason that night and explained the plan. He was hesitant at first, terrified of what Vanessa might do if she suspected betrayal. But when I told him about William Patterson, about the accident in Florida, about the pattern that Eleanor had uncovered, his fear transformed into something harder. Resolve, maybe, or the desperate courage of a man who finally realizes he's been sleeping beside a monster. She's going to push you to bring me the POA papers, I told him. When she does, I want you to agree immediately. Don't hesitate, don't argue. Let her think she's won. Can you do that? Yes. His voice was steadier than I'd heard it in years. I can do that, Dad. The performance began the next morning. I walked up to the main house under the pretense of wanting to discuss family matters. Vanessa greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her gaze sharp and assessing as I shuffled past her into the living room. I made sure to move slowly, to let my hand shake slightly when I reached for the back of a chair for support. I've been thinking, I said, then paused, letting confusion flicker across my face. I've been thinking about. What was I saying? The papers. The ones you wanted me to sign. I looked at Vanessa, then at Jason, then back at Vanessa. Eleanor, could you get me some water? My throat is dry. I watched Vanessa's expression carefully as I called her by my dead wife's name. She couldn't quite hide the flash of triumph in her eyes, the predatory satisfaction of a hunter who sees her prey stumbling. She exchanged a quick glance with Jason, a glance that said everything she didn't need to put into words. Of course, Henry, she said sweetly, playing along with my confusion. I'll get you some water. Jason, why don't you sit with your father while I'm gone? Over the next 3 days, I continued the performance. I forgot words mid-sentence, searching for terms I'd used my entire life. I trembled when holding documents, as if the simple weight of paper was becoming too much for my aged hands. I wandered into rooms and stood looking lost, then shuffled out again, muttering about something I'd meant to do. Each sign of decline was carefully calculated, each moment of weakness precisely timed. Vanessa responded exactly as I'd predicted. She became solicitous, almost kind, helping me to chairs and speaking in the slow, loud voice people use with the very old or the very young. But beneath that performance of concern, I could see her excitement building. She thought she was watching me deteriorate before her eyes. She thought victory was finally within reach. On the 4th day, she made her move. Jason, I think it's time, I heard her say through the kitchen window where I'd positioned myself to observe. Your father is clearly struggling. We need to help him by taking over the management of the ranch before he does something that hurts himself or the property. Bring him the power of attorney papers today. Jason played his part perfectly. He hesitated just long enough to seem reluctant, then nodded with the defeated slump of a man who'd given up fighting. All right, I'll talk to him this afternoon. He came to my cabin at 4 o'clock, the POA documents in a manila folder. I saw Vanessa's car parked up the road, positioned where she could watch through my cabin windows without being obvious about it. She wanted to witness her triumph firsthand. Dad, I need you to sign these, Jason said, loud enough for anyone listening to hear. He placed the documents on my table with hands that trembled, genuinely trembled, though from fear of Vanessa rather than the theatrical weakness I'd been displaying. I picked up the papers and squinted at them, making a show of struggling to read the fine print. What is this? What am I signing? It's just a power of attorney, Dad. It lets me help you manage the ranch. Nothing to worry about. I shook my head slowly, then sighed the heavy sigh of a man who knows he's losing a battle. I suppose you're right. I have been forgetting things lately. I picked up the pen Jason offered, letting it shake in my grip. Your mother would want me to trust you. Eleanor always said family should take care of family. I signed each page where Jason indicated, my handwriting wavering but legible. When I finished, I pushed the documents back across the table and let my shoulders slump in defeat. Jason gathered the papers and left without another word. Through my window, I watched him walk to Vanessa's car and hand her the folder. Even from this distance, I could see her practically vibrating with excitement as she rifled through the pages, checking each signature. She drove away before Jason reached the main house, unable to wait even a few hours to claim her prize. What Vanessa didn't know was that Mark Ellison had already contacted every financial institution connected to my assets. What she didn't know was that the trust structure we'd created made that POA legally worthless for anything that actually mattered. She was clutching a loaded gun with no bullets, rushing to a confrontation she couldn't possibly win. Charlie emerged from behind the barn, lowering the camera he'd used to document the entire exchange. He gave me a nod, confirming he'd captured everything, Vanessa waiting and watching, her eager receipt of the documents, her hurried departure. I stood at my window, watching her taillights disappear down the road toward town. Run to the bank, Vanessa, I said softly. They're expecting you, and so is someone else. The sun was setting over the ranch when I heard the truck coming up the road. It wasn't a vehicle I recognized, a dark blue pickup with government plates, moving slowly as if the driver was taking careful note of his surroundings. I stepped onto my porch and waited, my hand resting near the old hunting rifle I kept just inside the door. After everything I'd learned about Vanessa, I wasn't taking chances with unexpected visitors. The truck stopped 20 feet from my cabin. The man who stepped out was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He wore civilian clothes, but his bearing was unmistakably law enforcement, the careful way he moved, the constant awareness of his environment, the habit of keeping his hands visible. A badge hung from his belt. Henry Caldwell? His voice was calm, measured, with a trace of Florida in his vowels. My name is Rowan Tate. I'm a sheriff over in the next county. I think you've been expecting me. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. Rowan, William Patterson's son, the man Eleanor had mentioned in her notes, the one who dedicated his career to finding evidence against the woman who killed his father. I've been expecting someone, I said carefully. Come inside. I think we have a lot to talk about. He followed me into the cabin and accepted the coffee I offered, settling into the chair across from my small kitchen table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We were taking each other's measure, two men bound by a common enemy, trying to determine if the other could be trusted. Tate broke the silence first. Your wife contacted me 2 years ago. She'd hired a private investigator to look into Vanessa's past, and the trail led to my father. Eleanor sent me everything she'd found, the investigator's report, her own notes, her suspicions about what Vanessa was planning. He paused, staring down at his coffee cup. She told me to watch over you if anything happened to her. Said you were a good man who deserved to know the truth about the woman living in your house. Eleanor never mentioned any of this to me. She said she wanted to protect you. Said you'd already spent 30 years fighting predators and deserved to enjoy your retirement in peace. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. She also said you'd probably figure it out on your own eventually, that you were sharper than you let on. I thought about my wife, dying of cancer, yet still finding the strength to build alliances and gather evidence, still fighting to protect me even as her own battle was being lost. The depth of her love continued to stagger me. Tell me about your investigation, I said. Tell me everything. Tate talked for nearly an hour. He'd spent 7 years building a profile of Vanessa, tracking her movements, documenting her methods. What he'd discovered was worse than I'd imagined. Vanessa had a pattern, a predatory algorithm she'd refined over time. She targeted widowers with valuable property men who appeared isolated, vulnerable, easily manipulated. But she was smart enough to know that marrying these men directly would raise suspicions. Instead, she married sons or nephews, younger men she could control, using them to gain access to the family while maintaining plausible deniability. Once inside, she worked to isolate the elderly patriarch from anyone who might protect him. She undermined his relationships, questioned his competency, positioned herself as the concerned family member just trying to help. Then, when she had legal control through a POA or conservatorship, the patriarch died. Always from something that could be explained away: a fall, a medication mix-up, a sudden decline in health, never anything that screamed murder. Always something that left just enough doubt to prevent prosecution. My father was her first success, Tate said, his voice tight with controlled anger. At least the first one I can prove. He signed a POA 18 months after the wedding. 3 months later, he fell down the stairs of his own home. Vanessa claimed she was out shopping. He shook his head slowly. Dad was the most sure-footed man I ever knew. He built houses for 40 years, spent half his life on ladders and scaffolding. He didn't just fall, but you couldn't prove it. Not then. The investigation was closed too quickly, and Vanessa's lawyer was good, made my family look like greedy children trying to steal our inheritance. Tate's jaw tightened. We settled out of court because we couldn't afford to keep fighting. She walked away with $2 million of my father's money, and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. I understood now why he'd become a law enforcement officer. It wasn't just about justice. It was about making sure he'd have the tools and authority to stop Vanessa when she inevitably struck again. So what's the plan? I asked. You can't arrest her directly. Conflict of interest would taint any case you built. Tate nodded. I've been coordinating with Florida authorities for the past year. They're willing to reopen my father's case if we can provide new evidence of a pattern, proof that Vanessa has done this before, that my father wasn't an isolated incident. He leaned forward. That's where you come in, Mr. Caldwell. You're her current target. Everything she does to you, every document she forges, every lie she tells, it all builds the pattern that proves my father was murdered. The alliance was complete now. I had Mark Ellison protecting my assets through legal channels, Charlie Boone documenting Vanessa's every move, Linda Hargrove holding Eleanor's evidence, Jason feeding us information from inside the enemy camp, and now Sheriff Rowan Tate, connecting us to the law enforcement resources that would ultimately bring Vanessa to justice. Tate reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward me. I opened it and found myself staring at an official document stamped with the seal of the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office. Cold case file on William Patterson's death, Tate said quietly. Officially reopened as of last month, based on new evidence suggesting a pattern of predatory behavior by his surviving spouse. His eyes met mine, burning with 7 years of suppressed rage and grief. When she goes down for what she's doing to you, Florida's going to want to talk to her about my father. The morning after Tate's visit, I positioned myself at my cabin window with a cup of coffee and waited. Vanessa had left the main house early, dressed in what she probably considered her most professional outfit, the signed POA documents clutched in her manicured hands. I watched her car disappear down the road toward town and felt a grim satisfaction settle into my bones. She was walking into a trap she couldn't possibly see coming. I didn't have to wait long for news of what happened. Robert Simmons called me within 2 hours, his voice carrying a mixture of professional concern and barely concealed amazement. Henry, you need to hear this directly from me before the gossip starts spreading. Your daughter-in-law just made quite a scene at my bank. I settled deeper into my chair and listened as Robert recounted the morning's events. Vanessa had arrived at First National Bank at precisely 9:15, striding through the front doors with the confidence of a woman who believed she'd already won. She'd approached the main counter and demanded to speak with someone about accessing the Caldwell Ranch accounts. When a junior clerk tried to assist her, Vanessa had waved off the young woman dismissively and insisted on seeing the branch manager directly. Robert had greeted her in his office with professional courtesy, accepting the POA documents she thrust toward him. He'd examined each page carefully, noting my signature, the dates, the legal language. Then he'd excused himself to verify the documentation, leaving Vanessa alone with her anticipation. What Vanessa didn't know was that Robert had been expecting her. I'd briefed him personally 3 days earlier, explaining the trust structure Mark had created and the protective clauses we'd built into it. Robert had flagged my accounts with a special notation and prepared his staff for exactly this scenario. 30 minutes passed. Vanessa grew increasingly restless, checking her phone, tapping her fingers against Robert's desk, craning her neck to see through the glass walls of his office. When Robert finally returned, he wasn't alone. Two security officers flanked him, their presence a clear signal that this conversation was not going to go the way Vanessa had expected. Robert had delivered the news with the calm precision of a man who'd rehearsed these words. The ranch and all associated assets were held in an irrevocable trust that explicitly voided any power of attorney authority over trust property. The document Vanessa was holding, while properly signed, was legally worthless for the purposes she intended. It gave her no access to the accounts, no authority to mortgage the property, no power whatsoever over anything that actually mattered. Furthermore, Robert had continued, Henry Caldwell had filed a formal report with the bank regarding potential elder financial exploitation. Vanessa's name had been flagged in their system. Any future attempts to access these accounts would be automatically reported to both the bank's legal department and local law enforcement. According to Robert, that was when Vanessa's composure shattered completely. She'd risen from her chair so violently that it toppled backward, crashing against the floor. Her voice, usually so carefully modulated, had risen to a shriek that carried through the glass walls and into the main lobby. She'd called Robert incompetent, threatened lawsuits against the bank and everyone in it, demanded that someone call Henry immediately and explain to him what his daughter-in-law was trying to do for the family. The scene had drawn attention from every customer in the building. Robert mentioned, with some satisfaction, that several of them were people I knew, neighbors and friends who'd watched Vanessa's performance with shocked expressions. By noon, half the county would know that Vanessa Caldwell had been escorted out of First National Bank by security officers while screaming about conspiracies and ungrateful family members. But the bank humiliation was only the beginning. Robert had one more detail to share, something he'd witnessed through his office window as he watched Vanessa storm across the parking lot toward her car. A deputy's vehicle had been parked next to hers, and a young officer had been leaning against it, clearly waiting. As Vanessa approached, the deputy had straightened and stepped forward, badge visible, a folder of documents in his hand. "Ma'am," the deputy had said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "we need to ask you some questions about a matter in Florida." Robert said Vanessa's reaction was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The fury drained from her face, replaced by something that looked very much like terror. Her hands, which had been gesturing wildly moments before, began to shake visibly at her sides. "I don't know anyone in Florida," she'd screamed at the deputy. "I've never even been to Florida. You have the wrong person. This is harassment, and I'll have your badge for this." But even from across the parking lot, Robert could see that her protests were hollow. The confidence that had carried her into the bank that morning had evaporated completely. She was no longer a predator in control of her hunt. She was prey, suddenly realizing that she'd wandered into someone else's trap. The deputy had remained calm, professional, unmoved by her theatrics. He'd simply repeated that he needed to ask her some questions and suggested they could do it here or at the station, whichever she preferred. Vanessa had chosen neither. She'd pushed past him, climbed into her car, and driven away so fast that her tires left marks on the pavement. I thanked Robert for the call and hung up, staring out my window at the peaceful Texas landscape. Somewhere out there, Vanessa was racing back to the ranch, her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. The past she thought she'd buried in Florida was clawing its way back to the surface, and we were just getting started. 3 days passed after Vanessa's humiliation at the bank. She stayed holed up in the main house, refusing to speak to anyone, not even Jason. Through Charlie's careful observation, I learned she'd spent most of that time on the phone with lawyers, trying to find some angle to salvage her position. She was wounded but not defeated, and I knew from experience that wounded predators are the most dangerous kind. It was time to end this. I sent out invitations to a gathering at the ranch, framed as an opportunity to clear the air about recent family misunderstandings. I invited extended family members who'd grown distant over the years. Neighbors who'd witnessed Vanessa's meltdown at the bank, old friends who'd known Eleanor and me since we first broke ground on this land. The response was overwhelming. People wanted to know what was happening to the Caldwell family, and they were willing to show up to find out. Vanessa took the bait exactly as I'd predicted. She emerged from her seclusion looking polished and composed, every hair in place, her smile firmly fixed. I watched her work the room as guests arrived, playing the concerned daughter-in-law, the misunderstood wife just trying to help her aging father-in-law through a difficult time. She'd rehearsed her narrative well. Henry was sadly declining. She'd only been trying to protect family assets. The incident at the bank was a terrible misunderstanding that she hoped to clear up today. Some guests nodded sympathetically. Others looked skeptical. But everyone was listening. I let her have her moment. I stood quietly by the fireplace, accepting expressions of concern, playing my part as the confused old man at the center of a family dispute. Jason stood near the kitchen doorway, his face carefully blank, waiting for the signal we'd agreed upon. At precisely 3 o'clock, Linda Hargrove walked through the front door. She carried a small envelope in her hands, marked with the number 3 in Eleanor's handwriting. The final envelope. The last weapon my wife had left me. Vanessa's eyes tracked Linda across the room, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her carefully composed features. She didn't know what was coming, but some predatory instinct told her that the dynamic had just shifted. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice carrying easily through the crowded living room. "I know there's been a lot of talk lately about what's happening in this family, about my health, my mental state, whether I'm capable of managing my own affairs." I paused, letting the words settle. I thought it was time everyone heard the truth. Not my version or Vanessa's version, but the truth in someone else's words entirely. Linda handed me the envelope. Inside was a USB drive, small and unassuming, containing the last secret Eleanor had kept. I plugged it into the television setup that Jason had prepared earlier, and the screen flickered to life. Eleanor's face appeared, and I heard several guests gasp. She looked healthier in this recording than she had at the end, though the shadows under her eyes hinted at the illness already taking root. She was sitting in our kitchen, 2 cups of tea on the table before her. Across from her sat Vanessa. "I just want to understand your plans, dear," Eleanor's recorded voice said, gentle and seemingly confused. "For after I'm gone, what will happen to the ranch? To Henry?" Vanessa on the screen smiled, the patronizing smile I'd come to know so well. "Don't worry yourself about that, Eleanor. Jason and I will take care of everything. But Henry loves this ranch so much, it would break his heart to leave." Well, Vanessa's recorded image leaned back, completely at ease, utterly confident that she was speaking to a dying woman who would never repeat these words. "Jason will get everything eventually. The old man can't last forever. Once he's in a care home, we'll have control. It's really just a matter of waiting." The room had gone completely silent. I watched faces transform as Vanessa continued speaking on the screen, dismissing Eleanor's sentimental attachment to the land, explaining how easy it was to manipulate elderly people who were desperate for family connection, laughing about how Henry was too trusting for his own good. "The trick is patience," the recorded Vanessa explained, swirling her tea. "You don't push too hard too fast. You just slowly cut them off from everyone who might help them. Friends, neighbors, other family members. Eventually, they have no one left but you. And then they'll sign anything you put in front of them." Eleanor's voice, thick with emotion she was struggling to hide, asked one final question. "And if Henry doesn't cooperate? If he refuses to go to a care home?" Vanessa's smile on the screen turned cold. "There are ways to deal with stubborn old men, Eleanor. Don't you worry about that." The video ended. The screen went dark. Every eye in the room turned to Vanessa. The real Vanessa, standing frozen near the window, her face drained of all color. The sympathetic nods she'd collected earlier had vanished. In their place were expressions of disgust, betrayal, fury. Family members who'd given her the benefit of the doubt now looked at her like she was something they'd scraped off their boots. Vanessa's voice came out strangled. "That's not she manipulated me. This is entrapment." She turned toward the door, ready to run, and stopped dead. Sheriff Rowan Tate stood in the doorway, his badge clearly visible, a folded document in his hand. 2 deputies flanked him, blocking any escape. "Vanessa Patterson Caldwell," Tate said, his voice resonating with 7 years of suppressed grief and finally realized justice. "Florida authorities have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the death of William Patterson." He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers, and I personally requested to deliver it. The room erupted into chaos. Guests shouted questions, pushed toward the windows to see better, pulled out phones to record what was happening. Vanessa stood paralyzed in the center of the living room, her escape route blocked by Sheriff Tate and his deputies, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her in real time. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered, but her voice had lost its commanding edge. "I haven't done anything wrong. That video was manipulated. Eleanor was senile when she recorded it. None of this would hold up in court." Tate stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. "Ma'am, you're being arrested on multiple charges. Attempted elder financial abuse under Texas statute, fraud by misrepresentation, and a persons of interest warrant from the state of Florida regarding the suspicious death of William Patterson." He produced handcuffs from his belt. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The click of those handcuffs closing around Vanessa's wrists was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in years. The woman who had humiliated me at my own son's birthday party, who had called me a caretaker on my own land, who had shut the door of my own house in my face, that woman was now being led through a crowd of witnesses with her hands bound behind her back. The neighbors who had heard her screaming at bank employees watched in silence. The family members who had once accepted her explanations now stepped aside to let the deputies through. The community that she had tried to manipulate against me bore witness to her downfall. This was justice, not the violent kind that leaves everyone bloody. The quiet kind that comes from patience, preparation, and the truth finally being spoken aloud. As the deputies guided Vanessa toward the front door, Jason stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the kitchen. His face was pale but determined, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. "Wait. Before she goes, there's something I need to say." Every eye turned to him. Vanessa's expression shifted from fear to warning, a silent threat passing between them. But Jason didn't flinch this time. Whatever hold she'd had over him was broken. "For the past 3 years, my wife has been blackmailing me," Jason said. "She discovered something I did 5 years ago, something terrible, and she used it to control every aspect of my life. She told me if I didn't help her gain control of my father's ranch, she would destroy me." He paused, gathering himself. I let her abuse my father, disrespect my mother's memory, and tear apart my family because I was too afraid to face what I'd done." The room was utterly silent now. Even Vanessa had stopped struggling against the deputy's grip. "5 years ago, I was driving drunk," Jason continued, his voice cracking. "I hit a man crossing the street. He survived, but with permanent injuries. I fled the scene. I told myself I'd turn myself in eventually, that I'd find the courage to do the right thing. But I never did, and Vanessa found out, and she's been holding it over me ever since." He turned to face the crowd directly. "I've been a coward. I let my worst mistake become a weapon that hurt everyone I love, but I won't hide anymore. I've contacted the victim's family. I've spoken with the district attorney. I'm ready to accept whatever consequences come." I stepped forward and placed my hand on my son's shoulder. This was the moment we'd planned together, the moment Jason would finally break free from both his guilt and his tormentor. But the emotion in his voice, the trembling in his stance, that was all real. On the television screen behind us, a video call connected. The face that appeared belonged to Marcus Webb, the man Jason had struck 5 years ago. He sat in a wheelchair, his wife beside him, their expressions solemn but not hostile. "Mr. Caldwell contacted us last week," Marcus said, his voice carrying through the speakers. He explained everything, what his son did, how he's been living with it, what that woman did to keep him silent. He paused, exchanging a glance with his wife. "We've had 5 years to be angry, 5 years to wonder who hit me and drove away, finding out it was a scared young man who's been punishing himself ever since. It doesn't make what happened okay, but it changes things." Marcus's wife spoke next. "We've decided to pursue restorative justice rather than criminal prosecution, community service, restitution, and a public commitment to drunk driving awareness programs." She looked directly at Jason through the screen. "We're not doing this because we forgive you. We're doing this because destroying your life won't give Marcus his legs back, and because we can see you've been a victim too." Jason broke down then, tears streaming openly as he thanked them. I kept my hand on his shoulder, feeling the release of years of tension and fear finally flowing out of him. My son had made a terrible choice 5 years ago, but today he'd made a better one. The deputies began moving Vanessa toward the door again. She'd watched the entire exchange with growing fury, realizing that even her last weapon, Jason's secret, had been neutralized. As they led her past me, she stopped, forcing the deputies to halt. Her eyes locked onto mine, blazing with hatred. You think you've won? She hissed. I've survived worse than you, old man. This isn't over. I'll be out in a year. And when I am, I met her gaze steadily, feeling the calm certainty that comes from knowing you've done everything right. You survived because no one was prepared for you, I said quietly. Because William Patterson didn't know what you were. Because my son was too scared to fight back. Because you always chose victims who couldn't see you coming. I stepped closer, my voice dropping so only she could hear. I saw you coming from a mile away, and so did my wife. You're not surviving this, Vanessa. Not this time. The deputies pulled her away. I watched through the window as they loaded her into the patrol car. Her designer clothes rumpled, her perfect hair disheveled, her mask finally and permanently shattered. Jason came to stand beside me, wiping his eyes. Is it really over, Dad? I put my arm around my son. For her, yes. For us, it's just beginning. 6 months can change everything. I sat on Eleanor's rocking chair, the one I'd carved for her 40 years ago, watching the sun sink below the Texas horizon in ribbons of orange and gold. This had been our ritual for 4 decades, ending each day together on this porch, watching the light fade over the land we'd built from nothing. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to sit in this chair. It felt too empty without her beside me. Now, finally, it felt like coming home. The ranch had been transformed in the months since Vanessa's arrest. Jason and I had worked side by side to undo everything she'd changed, to restore the property to the way Eleanor had loved it. Her garden bloomed again along the south side of the house, roses and lavender and herbs filling the air with the scents of 40 years of memories. Her photographs lined the walls once more, our wedding portrait back in its place of honor above the fireplace. Every room held echoes of the woman who had made this house a home. The sound of hammering drifted across the evening air. I turned to see Jason on the roof of the old barn, replacing shingles that had needed attention for years. He'd been working from dawn to dusk lately, throwing himself into the physical labor of ranch maintenance with an intensity that surprised us both. He'd moved into the guest cabin after the divorce was finalized, selling the house in town that he'd shared with Vanessa and putting the money toward his restitution payments to Marcus Webb. He climbed down the ladder as the light faded, wiping sweat from his forehead, and walked over to join me on the porch. His hands were calloused now, his skin tanned from weeks of outdoor work. He looked more like my son than he had in years. Roof should hold through winter now, he said, settling into the chair beside mine. Tomorrow I'll start on the fence line along the north pasture. Charlie showed me where the posts are rotting. You don't have to do all this yourself, you know. We can hire help. Jason shook his head. I want to earn my place here, Dad, the way you and Mom did. I spent too many years taking this ranch for granted, letting someone else tell me it was just an asset to be liquidated. He stared out at the darkening fields. I want to understand what you built. I want to deserve it. I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. For so long, I'd seen my son as weak, as a disappointment, as someone who'd chosen a manipulative wife over his own father. I understood now how wrong I'd been. Jason wasn't weak. He'd been trapped, controlled, slowly crushed under the weight of his own guilt and his wife's relentless manipulation. What I was seeing now wasn't a new person. It was the son I'd always had, finally free to become himself. A car pulled up the driveway, and I recognized Linda's silver sedan. She'd been coming by 2 or 3 times a week since Vanessa's arrest, bringing casseroles and company and stories about Eleanor that made me laugh and cry in equal measure. She wasn't a replacement for my wife, no one could ever be that, but she was a cherished friend, a living connection to the woman I'd loved, and her presence had helped fill some of the emptiness that had haunted this house for 2 years. Sheriff Tate came by less frequently, but his visits meant just as much. The Florida trial was scheduled for next spring, and the evidence was overwhelming. Vanessa faced charges not just for what she'd tried to do to me, but for what she'd done to William Patterson. Tate had finally found the justice he'd spent 7 years seeking. The last time he visited, I'd seen something in his eyes that hadn't been there before peace. Charlie had been given a permanent stake in the ranch, a share of ownership that would pass to his children after him. He'd protested at first, insisting he was just a hired hand, but I'd reminded him that loyalty like his was beyond price. He still watched over the property with the same quiet vigilance he'd always shown, but now he did it as a partner rather than an employee. The next morning, I drove to the cemetery on the edge of town. Eleanor's grave sat beneath an old oak tree, the headstone simple and elegant, exactly as she would have wanted. I knelt on the grass and placed fresh flowers against the marble roses from her garden, the first blooms of the season. She tried to take everything we built, I said softly. She tried to erase you from this land, to steal the legacy we created together. But you saw her coming, Eleanor. You prepared for her. You protected me from beyond the grave. A breeze stirred the leaves above me, and I could almost feel her presence, warm and loving and eternally patient. Rest now, my love. Justice is done. Vanessa will pay for what she did to William Patterson, and she'll never hurt anyone else again. I touched the headstone, tracing the letters of her name with my weathered fingers. I'll see you soon enough, but not yet. Our son still needs me. He's finally becoming the man you always knew he could be. I stood slowly, my knees protesting the movement, and looked out over the peaceful cemetery toward the land that had been my life's work. The land Eleanor and I had built together. The land that would pass to Jason someday, when he was ready, when he'd earned it through sweat and dedication and the kind of love that doesn't give up. Vanessa had come to take everything. She'd schemed and manipulated and threatened, believing she could break an old man and steal his legacy. But all she'd lost was herself, her freedom, her reputation, her future. And all I'd found, in the wreckage of her failed ambitions, was something I'd thought was gone forever. Some loves never die. They just wait for us to need them again. If you had told me a year ago that my daughter-in-law would try to steal my ranch, destroy my family, and erase every trace of the woman I loved, I would have said you were telling a story too dramatic to be true. But life has a way of testing us in ways we never expect. Vanessa Caldwell thought she saw an easy target when she looked at me, a grieving widower, an aging rancher, a quiet old man who would fold under pressure. She was wrong. She underestimated the power of preparation, the strength of true allies, and most of all, the love of a wife who protected her husband even from beyond the grave. Eleanor saw the danger coming when I was too blind to notice. She left me the weapons I needed to fight back. And when the time came, I used every single one of them. Today, my ranch is whole again. My son is healing. And Vanessa is facing justice for crimes that span 2 states and 2 destroyed families. Some people think revenge is about anger, about making someone suffer the way they made you suffer. But I learned something different. True justice is not about destruction. It is about protection. It is about standing up for what you built and refusing to let anyone take it from you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched your heart or reminded you of someone in your own life who fought back against those who tried to take everything from them, please share this video with your friends and family. Leave a comment below telling me about a time when you or someone you love had to stand up against injustice. I read every single comment, and your stories inspire me more than you know. If you have not already, please subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell so you never miss another story. Until next time, remember this. No matter how old you are, no matter how alone you feel, you are never too weak to fight for what is yours. You just need the courage to start.